Hi, and now we're going to do part 2 of development. Now, if you remember, part 1, we looked at heredity and the prenatal development and physical development and learning. In part 2, we're going to cover the cognitive stages of development, socialization, and social relationships with a special issue and concerns regarding late adulthood. All right, so we're going to begin with Piaget. Now, Piaget believed that intellect developed in 4 stages, each representing a qualitatively different form of reasoning and understanding. He also believed the stages to be universal, that is for all cultures, and to occur in an invariant sequence. That is to say, everything happens in the order that they're designed in, and they are universal across wherever they may be. And that was one of the things that he thought was really important. And although the rate at which children progress through them may differ, they go 1, then to 2, then to 3, then to 4. They don't go 1, 3, 2, 4. And you can't speed it up. But there's a range. If you're a grade 1 or a 2 teacher, you see this range in a classroom of 35 students. Some will have achieved, not sensimotor, but they have, precognitive, but others won't until partway through the school year. And so that's an important component about Piaget's development. Now we'll look at each stage. The first is what's known as sensimotor stage. The second is pre-operational stage. 3 is concrete operations, and then 4 is formal operations stage. And we'll start with sensomotor operation. And this is generally, if you will, to range it, birth to 2 years old. And Piaget's first stage, cognitive development, accumulates in the development of object permanence. That is to say, how you play with a child. Here's the little toy, and you put it behind your back, and the child thinks it disappears. Well, the child that has achieved object permanence knows that it's just behind your back. It doesn't disappear because you can't see it. So, the first stage looks at development of object permanence and the beginning of representational thought. That one thing represents another, kind of like language. Then there's the pre-operational stage. This is 2 to 7 years old. This is a stage of rapid development in language, thinking, and this is governed by perception rather than logic. And so that first stage sort of sets us up to be familiar with and receptive to language and this idea that perception is important. And perception is that representation, or that C has a sound of C and K and can be a part of the word cat and circle. Okay, so those are things that we start to get into this pre-operational stage. Then we get into the concrete operation stage. This is age 7 to 11 or 12. Children acquire the concept of reversibility and conservation and are able to apply logical thinking to concrete objects. Children gradually demonstrate less egocentric thinking at this point, and they come to realize that other people have thoughts and feelings that may be different from their own. They acquire the ability to mentally carry out the operations essential for logical thought. And then the last stage is the formal operation stage. This is between 11 and 12 years of age and beyond. Adolescents and adults can apply logical thinking to abstract, verbal, and hypothetical situations, to problems in the past, the present, and the future. Now, conventional wisdom holds that intellectual abilities reach its peak at the late teens or early 20s, and that it's a downhill from there. This is also incorrect. Adolescents tend to do better on tests requiring speed or rote memory. Adult intellectual performances tend to increase in other areas. In tests measuring general information, vocabulary, reasoning ability, and social judgment, older individuals usually do better due to experience and education. Now, although younger people tend to do better on tests, speed of memory, and rote memory, intellectual performance show modest gains until the mid-40s. The modest decline occurs from the 60s to the 80s. Now, scholars scientists and those in the arts are usually more productive in their 40s. Now, in order for us to effectively navigate the social world we live in is a process what we know as socialization. Now, here we are exposed to the behaviors, the attitudes, and the values of any given society that we happen to be living in. So if we're raised in, here we are, Canada, then the behaviors, the attitudes, and the values I learn allow me to navigate and be successful in the society of Canada. Now, this is influenced by our families first, friends coming up, school, media, religion, education, and there's a variety of social institutions that affect our socialization. Now, Erikson, he developed a theory that he thought that there were these social forces on human development. Now, social forces can be family, peers, school, religion, media, friends. These are social forces. So he believed that these social forces influence our human development. And Erikson believed that an individual progresses through 8 psychosocial stages during the lifespan, each defined by a conflict with the social environment that must be resolved. The 4 stages in childhood are the basic trust versus basic mistrust. And this occurs between birth and 2 years of age. The next stage, the second, is autonomy versus shame and doubt, and this occurs between 1 and 3 years of age. The third, initiative versus guilt, 3 to 6 years of age. And industry, and this was industry versus inferiority, is between 6 years old and puberty. And then we get into the more advanced stages as we age and get older in our adulthood, where we move to, in our adolescence, identity versus role confusion. Then it's followed by intimacy versus isolation. This is young adulthood. And then by middle age, we're into the generativity versus stagnation. And then lastly, in our later life, we're into the ego integrity versus despair. Now, we're going to have a brief look at each of these 8 stages of psychosocial development. In trust and mistrust, the infant must gain a sense of predictability and trust in its caretakers, or risk developing mistrust. So this is basically, the simple version of this would be, if I cry because I'm hungry, I get fed. If I cry because I'm wet, I get changed. If I cry because I need cuddling, I get cuddled. That establishes trust in the caregiver, and so that first stage is a healthy, positive, I understand my caregivers and I trust them. Now, if I did those same things to get those same things and my caregivers didn't do so reliably, I might start to mistrust. And then all of this starts to build as we move through the stages. In autonomy versus shame and doubt, the toddler needs to become physically independent. And so a lot of what's occurring here is, in this period of time, in the second stage of autonomy and shame, is that we are exploring our environment and becoming more and more independent with walking and doing and getting and helping. These are things that help us develop our sense of independence. Whereas if we can't be autonomous, we tend to grow up with a bit of shame about what we can't do or don't do or haven't had exposure to. The third is the initiative versus guilt. And here the preschool child is developing an emotional and a psychological independence. Now, this psychological and emotional independence is really mostly noted when the child starts going to school and they have to be standing on their own 2 feet and not just standing at the door crying, missing their parents. And so what's occurring here is this, I can take initiative and join a group, find a friend, as opposed to having this sense of guilt of not being able to do that and standing back all the time. The fourth stage is the industry versus guilt. And here the industry versus inferiority. And here school-age children are gaining competence and then developing a self-esteem in relationship to everybody else. Now, as we move into the adolescence, here it's known as identity versus role confusion. And here the adolescent makes a transition from childhood to adulthood where the identity is the main focus, the who am I? Now, if I manage to sort this out in some manner, then I move on and I can start working towards the next stage. But if I don't achieve that, then what results is that role confusion. And it can result. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to be? The next level is what's known as intimacy versus isolation, and the young adult here must develop intimacy. Now, I'll come back to this just in a second here, but I'll just complete my thought. Intimacy is the ability to share, care for, and commit themselves to another person. Without this, isolation can ensue. Now, it's important to note that this particular term, intimacy, comes up in family sociology as one of the most important developmental tasks of forming a family, is you need to establish intimacy between the two parents, as it were, or the two adults need to form intimacy. And that's about closeness, sharing, disclosing secrets, if you will. You may not do this with everybody, but here is that small group or that one person whom I can establish intimacy with, and how important that is going forward in life. The next stage is what's called generativity versus stagnation. And in middle-aged people aim to establish ways to contribute to the development of the next generation. And so this sort of relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you start to approach the pinnacle, and really it's less about yourself and more about how you can act out of your own best interest to help the next generation. The ego integrity versus despair, which is what we do in late adulthood. Here, as individuals, we review our lives. You know, for the most part, if we look back on our life and we review things and we feel really pretty good about our lives, then there's a satisfaction, and that sense of accomplishment results in what's known as ego integrity. That if we can't see that we've done anything with our life worthwhile, then we might find ourselves in what we know as despair. Now, since early on, and often throughout our lives, parents play an important role in socialization. Now, researcher Harry Harlow, he found that the basis of attachment in infant monkeys is a contact comfort, and that monkeys raised with surrogates showed normal learning ability but abnormal social, sexual, and emotional behavior. So what about the development of attachment in humans? Well, Ainsworth identified 4 attachment patterns: secure, avoidant, resistant, and disorientated attachment. And well, let's look at these. Secure attachment, in this particular type or form of attachment, infants with this condition are usually distressed when separated from their mothers, eagerly seeking to reestablish contact after separation and then show an interest in play. And so secure is one stage or one level, if you will. There's another level. It's called avoidant. And here infants are usually unresponsive to the mother when she is present and are not troubled when she leaves. When a mother returns, the infant may actively avoid contact with her. Resistant attachment. Now this one is prior to a period of separation. Resistant infants seek and prefer close contact with their mother, yet they do not tend to branch out and explore securely like attached infants, or don't tend to explore like the securely attached individuals. And then the last stage or last type is disorganized, disorientated attachment. And this is when reunited with a mother, this group of infants exhibits contradictory and disorganized responses. Now, these are different levels of attachment which have a lot to do with that first stage of trust-mistrust in in Kohlberg's stages. So, partnering with or in relationship to attachment, there have also been styles, in this case 3 styles of parenting styles discussed by a researcher by the name of Diana Baumrind. And these 3 that she's identified are authoritarian, permissive and authoritative. And we'll see the distinction in a moment. Now, she found that the authoritative to be the best parenting style with the most positive long-term outcomes. But let's look at each of the three individually. Authoritarian, now these parents make rules, expect unquestioned obedience from their children, punish misbehavior, often it's punished through physical punishments, and value obedience to authority. Now, children disciplined in this manner tend to be withdrawn, anxious, and unhappy. Now we'll compare that to authoritative. Now here parents set high but realistic and reasonable standards. They enforce limits. That is, they say they're not avoiding saying no. And at the same time encouraging open communication and independence. Children raised in this way are the most mature, happy, and self-reliant, self-controlled, assertive, socially competent, and responsible. But it makes sense when given some responsibility and gradually getting more as you show competency and as you get older. And then the last is that permissive, where parents, through warm and supportive, although they are warm and supportive, they don't make very many rules or demands, and they usually don't enforce what those are and when they're broken. They allow children to make their own decisions and control their own behavior. Children raised in this manner are mostly immature, impulsive, and dependent. They also seem to be the least self-controlled and the least self-reliant. Now, as we enter adolescence, the role of peers become much more important in our socialization. And David Elkind, he believed that teenage years are marked by adolescent egocentrism, which he says takes two forms. One is the imaginary audience, he called it. And that's the belief that of adolescents that they are or will be the focus of attention in social situations, and that others will also be critical or approving as they are of themselves. So the imaginary audience isn't that there is an audience, but the teen is imagining that if I feel really good about who I am, so will everybody else. And they think that when they enter a room with a lot of other people, that somehow people are noticing them and are critical or are approving of who they are. Whether that's true or not, may be in the eye of the beholder. And so that's one type. Now the other was what he termed as personal fable. Now this would be considered an exaggerated sense of personal uniqueness and indestructibility, which may be the basis of the risk-taking that is common during adolescence. So as with many things in life, we establish our ideas of right and wrong. Lawrence Kohlberg believed that moral development related closely to cognitive development. So he studied moral development by presenting a series of moral dilemmas. Kohlberg was more interested in the reasons for participants' responses than he was in whether or not they judged it as right or wrong. So we're going to look at this. He classified moral behavior into 3 levels. Each level has 2 stages, and people progress from one stage to the next one at a time. Kohlberg's pre-conventional level is moral, where moral reasoning is based on the physical consequence of the act. Moral reasoning is based on the physical consequence of the act, reasoning and actions governed by the standard of others and not an internalized standard. So this first stage is a really sort of a learning stage, learning about what's right and wrong. So stage 1, right is whatever avoids punishment. If I did something and I got punishment, that's not right. So that's stage 1 of moral development. Stage 2, right is whatever is rewarded. It benefits the individual or it results in a favor being returned. And so those are the first 2 stages of moral development. Now at a conventional level, right and wrong are based on the internalized standards of others. Right is whatever helps or is approved by others or whatever is consistent with the laws of society. So in this particular level, conventional level, stage 3 is called the good boy, nice girl orientation. Good behavior is that which, one, pleases others and helps others, and two, is approved by others. Then, stage 4 is orientation towards authority. Now here, right is divided into 3 elements. Right is doing one's duty. So I've been given a responsibility and I do it. Respect authority. And maintaining the social order. That by doing one's duty and respecting authority, maintaining social order as a result. Then we go into post-conventional moral reasoning, and this involves weighing moral alternatives. Individuals weigh moral alternatives, realize the law may conflict with basic human rights. Right is whatever furthers basic human rights and requires the ability to think at Piaget's formal operations. So that's that sort of 11, 12-year-old group. So stage 5 believes the laws are formulated to protect both society and the individual. Laws should be changed if they fail to do so. At stage 6, ethical decisions based on universal principles which emphasize respect for human life, this includes justice, equality, and dignity, believe following consciousness may require us to violate laws. As we age, we need to explore issues of terminal illness and death. And here on one of the developmental responsibilities is to become accepting of the inevitability of death, thus needing to prepare ourselves for dying. It's one of the last sort of developmental tasks that we will need to achieve as we age, is this awareness that we will not live forever and that our dying will be inevitable. And then coming to grips with that. And there has been researchers who looked at this end stage of life. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross maintains that terminally ill patients go through 5 stages in coming to terms with death: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Let's look at them individually. Denial, this is the period of shock and disbelief. This can't be right. And you can apply this to any major life-changing change. Maybe as a result of some decision that I made, I'm now experiencing a lifelong disability. I maybe had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Who knows? This cycle of coping can apply, and you might want to look at that. When you first got the news of some major change, did you go through shock and disbelief? This can't be right. There must be something wrong. This can't be the way it is. Followed by 2, anger. Well, why me? Or why them? Anger, resentment, envy. We may then move into the 3rd stage, or bargaining, and we often will bargain with our deities, argue with God, strike a deal or postpone death. I will forever do this if I can have 2 more years, or I want to see my granddaughter get married. Bargaining. The 4th is depression or sadness, and sadness over the past and impending losses. You start to come to grips with, I can't deny it, my anger's not making this better. There's no bargain that I can make. I'm sad. I'm sad about the past, that I didn't make better decisions to affect where I am today. I'm sad because of where this is leading, and I have no choice. The 5th stage is that of acceptance. Struggling against death ends. Contemplating its coming without fear or despair is an adjustment that for many doesn't happen. Whether it's because you've entered into, as a result of Alzheimer's, into dementia, and you don't have that time and cognitive strength to do that anymore, or you've done so before you got to this point. It doesn't work for all people all the time. Now, bereavement is a period of grief following a person's death. This can linger long afterwards for the survivors. Those who suffer the most intense grief initially, who weep inconsolably and feel the deepest pain, do not get through their bereavement more quickly than others. There is what's known a term called dual process coping, and this is where there is periods of grieving and periods of relief. And it can be an effective means of coping with loss of a loved one, to sort of grief pause. For most people, the loss of a spouse is the most stressful event of a lifetime and leaves the remaining members at great risk for health problems and higher mortality rate, particularly in that first 6 months. Now, what we've done, and I know it sort of leaves on a bit of a sour note, death and dying and coping with that, but that completes, the developmental stages and the developmental movements through life that we all will experience at some point in our life. We are all right now at different stages. It would be interesting just to explore where you are in relationship to some of these stages and when you can foresee what might be coming forward in your future. All right, I hope this has been helpful. So good luck, everybody, and carry on the good fight. Bye now.